An inaugural lecture is a special event in the life of a university. It offers the opportunity for new professors to share some of their work with the wider university community. Perhaps even more importantly, it is also an opportunity to share that work with friends, colleagues, and guests from outside the university. Professor Dawn Scott obtained her BSc degree from Durham University, undertaking a final year project on badger territorial behaviour. She stayed at Durham, progressing to a PhD studying desert mammal ecology in Jordan. After this, she undertook postdoctoral work in the Kafue National Park in Zambia, assessing biodiversity. It was during this time that she developed an interest in human-wildlife conflict, the subject of this evening's lecture. She began lecturing in ecology and conservation at the University of Brighton in 2001, and has set up several research projects to investigate how humans and animals can sustainably coexist. Her research has explored human-carnivore conflict in Africa and how mammals and humans coexist in urban environments here in the UK. She is an advocate of citizen science approaches to research and is passionate about science communication. Dawn has a growing international reputation in the field of mammal ecology. However, her work is not confined to scientific journals and conferences. She has appeared frequently in the media, notably on Springwatch and related programs. Indeed, it is a measure of the reach of Dawn's work that when I was first offered a job at the University of Brighton and told my parents, my mum's first comment was not, "Well done, David, for getting a new job," but, "Oh, the University of Brighton. Isn't that where Dawn from Springwatch works?" But Dawn is much, much more than that. She is an excellent colleague, well-respected teacher, and a passionate advocate for conservation. Her research is highly respected in the academic world, but also accessible to the wider public. I invite Professor Dawn Scott to give her inaugural lecture entitled Human-Carnivore Conflict and Coexistence.
I had actually better turn my phone off as well. Thank you so much, David. I think he's already covered more or less what I was going to talk about this evening. I am pleasure to be here, and I'm obviously very honoured to have got my professorship. Just absolutely overwhelmed. What I was asked to do is obviously to give a talk about my career journey and also about what I'm passionate about in terms of research. And so what I thought I would do is focus on human-carnivore conflict and try to show you how my interest has developed by giving you examples of where I've come across human-carnivore conflict, what I've learned from it, and then how I've used that to help develop projects which have looked at trying to change conflict into coexistence. So I thought I'd set the context, and the context is 3 out of 4, 3/4 of all large terrestrial carnivores are in decline. We are very good at killing our large carnivores and making them extinct in many places. The major threats to carnivores is over-exploitation, persecution, which is killing, also habitat loss, habitat change, so we are creating more landscapes for us, urban areas, as well as agricultural landscapes, and in that change also is prey losses, natural prey losses, and this really has an impact on large carnivores. And because large carnivores are at the top of the food chain, they are smaller numbers, population growth is smaller, which means they're very susceptible to loss of numbers. Now, when I was young, I didn't know what I wanted to do. This is me about 18 months. But this is my first experience of human-carnivore conflict. This is Dinky, my first dog. And you can see that we're both competing for the same resource. And so it exemplifies human-carnivore conflict, really, in this photo, because that resource can be land, it can be competing for different types of resources, prey, But unfortunately, in most of these incidences, it's the carnivores that lose out and the humans win. And I think I did manage to get that rope off Dinky, even though I was only 18 months old. So when I was this age, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with my life. But looking back on photos, I realised that as I grew up, I started to develop a unique skill and a passion. And you can probably see from some of these photos what that was. This is me about 6 years old. Me again about 9, 10 years old. 11, starting to progress onto slightly larger animals. And then about 14. Anything that would come close, I tended to try and give it a cuddle, especially if it was furry and if it was a mammal, and also a carnivore. And I've been incredibly lucky that I've managed to make a career out of what I am passionate about. So I still seem to be grabbing carnivores at any opportunity to be able to give them a cuddle, in the name of research, of course. So as David said, I went to Durham University to do my degree. Everyone said, go and do medicine, you get a better pay, better job. But I knew I wanted to work with animals. And at Durham University, I was in the castle. This was my bedroom up here. Very Harry Potterish. We wore gowns and went for evening meals and things. But whilst at Durham, in my second year, I did a module on behavioural ecology with Nigel Dunstan. And this is where it started all making sense, and something that I became incredibly passionate about, which is behavioural ecology. Why animals do what they do. And it is all down to food, sex, and survival. It all makes sense. Animals don't do things like us, just sort of horrible things for pleasure. They do things to survive. So you can explain animal behaviour by evolution. Nigel was an expert in mustelids. He wrote a book on mink. And so in my final year, I really wanted to work with him as an undergraduate project to work on something carnivore. And I ended up wandering around in agricultural fields trying to find this. And as a carnivore ecologist, this is what dominates your life. And those of you, most of you in the room who know me will probably be able to identify this. This is badger poo. So I did a project on looking at badger territoriality, mainly looking for poo and bait markers in the poo. But actually, during this project is where I also came across another human-carnivore conflict. The conflict wasn't with the badgers, but actually what the people were doing to the badgers. So I came across a badger set that had been dug up. There was spades. There was a dead badger with its guts hanging out with bite wounds on it. And I had come across firsthand badger baiting. Now, that's quite horrible, so I thought I'd put a nice badger climbing a tree in the background to distract you. But badger baiting has been illegal for about 185 years. And last year, there was still 750 reports of badger baiting reported to the police in the UK. So my experience from this, and what I've decided to do, is have a coexistence toolbox. So whatever you have in life, whatever experience, try and take what you've learned from it and add it so that later on you can apply it. That's what we try and teach our students. And I wasn't an expert in human-carnivore conflict, but what I've done is taken elements as I've gone along. So with this example of badgers, one of the hardest lessons to learn is that some people kill animals for fun. And even though that doesn't sit with you, it does happen. And we are the only species that is cruel for fun, for our own entertainment. The next thing is that legislation and laws don't stop killing. They can control it, they don't stop it. So there needs to be other solutions rather than just legislation. So I'm going to stick them in my toolbox for now and move on to my next thing I did, which is I got asked by Nigel to become a mammal biodiversity coordinator in Jordan. I said yes. This is Jordan. Hey. So it was funded by the Darwin Initiative. I also got an award from the BBC Marion Zuntz Award. And this is one of my study sites on the Syrian border. There's my tent. Yay! This is my tent close up. So I spent nearly 3 years in the Syrian border in this basaltic desert. I didn't have a camel, I had a Land Rover, but it was the camel police that wandered around this region, so you can't really drive, you have to go by camel, apart from on these roads, these scrape roads here. So I went to Jordan with a lot of optimism. I wanted to do my PhD on carnivores. And I knew there was carnivores there in the past, and I found some evidence of carnivores there whilst I was there. These are rock carvings, and this is obviously the shape of a hyena, so the striped hyena. This is a nice distinctive shape of a leopard. There's previously cheetahs there as well, wolves, also jackals. And when we surveyed these limestone escarpment, which is actually called Feda al-Dahikia, which means floods of laughter, we found this massive big old hyena cave, and in here we found camel bones, oryx and gazelles, which haven't been in this area for quite a while, and also a human skull, which the hyenas obviously scavenged. But this was a very old, hundreds of year old hyena den. So we knew they were there, but unfortunately there wasn't many left. And when I talked to the people, have you seen any carnivores? When's the last time you saw them? This is the camel police up here, and I was chatting to them, and they said, oh yeah, we see carnivores, we kill them. So this is a fox, and they'd shot it outside the police station. I asked them why they shot it, was there a problem? And they said, no, we're just practicing shooting. They also have camels, and if a camel gets injured, they lace it with poison and leave it out. And they were very pleased that they'd managed to kill hyenas, wolves, jackals, and lots of foxes in a couple of months by leaving out a dead camel laced with poison. So they seem to do it out of saying it's their obligation to kill carnivores. When I talk to the Bedou, which are down here, they have cattle, they have goats and sheep, and there is a threat there from the carnivores taking their livestock. They have less access to guns, but they do still have the fear of the loss to their livestock, so they will control carnivores, but in less numbers. And also what was interesting talking to them is they said that if you see a hyena in the day, you have to kill it, because it will follow you home and steal your children in the night. So what was interesting here is there was lots of stories and folk stories about the fear of carnivores in this area. I did find some carnivores. This is a footprint of a wolf we came across, and this is a cat, so wild cat. And I also found some remnants of prey. So this was a gazelle that the police had, and they said that they'd shot the gazelle's mother so they could give the young gazelle as a present to one of the authorities as they came through to win favour. And this seems to be something that has historically been done in the past. So I had to change my PhD. There was no carnivores left. I went out to study carnivores, and I had to switch to small mammals. So I had to become a small mammal expert very quickly. And so I focused on jerds, jerboas, and jerds. This is a jerd, Sunderville's jerd. Vegetation, seeds, anything that would give me data to be able to write up a PhD. So human-carnivore conflict changed my life. It changed my PhD completely. But I also gained a few of my human-wildlife conflicts myself, having scorpions in my bed, poisonous snakes under my bed, and camel spiders in my small mammal traps. I understand people's fear of things that might look a bit strange and a bit scary and that can bite you. But I did manage to finish my PhD, and we did get some data. We managed to find a new subspecies of gerbil, and we managed to provide some information of how to do some survey methods of this area. And actually, that region in Jordan is now under heavy pressure from refugees and conflict. And so this data that nobody else has really been out there and collected data on animals in this region. But I do have hope that some of the carnivores can return, because people are monitoring these areas where there is conflict in the Middle East, and there are remnant populations of carnivores hanging on. So if it can stabilise, there may be a chance for them to recover. So what did I learn from Jordan? Talk to people. Different people have different perspectives, very different from your own. So don't go in with your same views. Different groups have different reasons for persecution, and historical persecution can contribute to the current status of carnivores in the region. Finding carnivores is really hard, especially if they're rare and they've been killed. It takes a lot of effort, so you have to change your methods. And folklore and stories can contribute to that fear, even if they're not founded in fact. So, where did I go next? Postdoc. I got asked to go to Zambia to work on a conservation organisation which had volunteers. So these are volunteers paying to come out to work on conservation. So I worked in Kafue National Park, and I upgraded from a tent in the desert to a tent in the national park. So I lived another year. This is my tent. So I spent nearly 4 years in a tent. And this is some of the group of volunteers and one of my research assistants at the time, Emma Stone, who now runs a project in Malawi. So in Zambia, we were doing biodiversity surveys, and we weren't necessarily focusing on carnivore conflict, but it did teach me a lesson about conflict in this area. So this is Kafue National Park, and we were working in the south. Down here is where we were based, and you can see here this is the edge of the park. Now on that edge of the park is where people are doing settlements of villages and growing crops. There is no fence of this park, and the wildlife can move freely. For elephants, growing crops like corn, maize is quite attractant. But these villages are quite small, and so if an elephant comes in, it can take a hell of a lot of food in a small visit and cause a lot of economic damage. So the biggest conflict in this area was the elephants going into the villages, and the villages were retaliating by poisoning the elephants, and we heard gunshots as well. So this wasn't poaching, this was about retaliation for loss of crops. So we were doing elephant behavioural studies. This involves sitting on the top of a Land Rover and watching elephants move where they're going. Fresh morning dung surveys, rooting through steaming piles of poo, again more poo, picking out seeds, trying to find if there's anthropogenic food, so human food or crops in that poo to give evidence that they are eating village crops, and also working with school communities as well to find out their perceptions of wildlife. So what did I learn from Zambia? Human-wildlife conflict can have huge economic losses for people. You need to understand that. You can't go in saying, well, you should be doing this, you should be doing that. It can take away their whole income for a year. Animals are responding to changes in the landscape. So if we're modifying things, they're just trying to survive and adapt. So we need to understand how what we do affects animal behaviour. We need to have baseline data and facts on species numbers, where they're going, what they're doing, and the behaviour of the animals, so that we can look at how we can change that and inform that through management. And we also need to have some proven methods that help reduce the impact and reduce the conflict. So I'll put them in my toolbox. Haven't really got onto carnivore conflict projects yet, but I am going on to now. So at the end of Zambia, my partner at the time, Tom Maddox, was working on his PhD in the Serengeti on cheetahs. And so I went to visit him to work on the project for a while, and he was looking at human-wildlife conflict, specifically with cheetahs and lions and the Maasai. And going from a tent, I went to live in the back of a Land Rover. Just luxury. So we were driving around in the Land Rover trying to find cheetahs in agricultural landscapes. So these are in landscapes where the Maasai were grazing their cattle. And what he was trying to do is looking at the difference in ecology with cheetahs and lions in these different landscapes, and whether the Maasai presence and what the Maasai were doing were affecting the communities and interactions between cheetahs and lions. And those of you that know about Maasai undertake lion hunts. So as a rite of passage into manhunt, they will go out and hunt lions with spears and shields. Many young men get injured in the hunts, and also lions get killed. But it is part of the cultural transition. Nowadays, the Maasai Association have stopped doing lion hunts because they understand lions are declining, but it is very much part of their culture. So Tom was investigating this. We went out and we were doing questionnaires with Maasai about their interactions with wildlife and carnivores. And one thing that was very interesting that came out is that it wasn't just the predators that there was concern, but the biggest concern actually came from other wildlife. So the wildebeest have a disease, it's like a fever that can be transmitted to their cattle. So this was a bigger concern than actually losses towards predators. So working with Tom in Tanzania, I found that people can be incredibly tolerant. The Maasai are incredibly tolerant of living very close to large carnivores. I'd like to see some of our communities living with lions and leopards wandering around the back gardens going, oh, it's fine, as long as they don't touch cattle, it's fine. There'd be outroar. So some communities can be incredibly tolerant. Coexistence and conflict can have cultural significance and be part of a culture. And major issues with wildlife are not always what you guess they are. So again, you need to talk to people. So whilst in Tanzania, I applied for my job at the University of Brighton, and I got it. Yay! I was very pleased. I was 27 and I got my lectureship. I was very keen to start, but I had a few things to do first that I'd signed up to do, and I had to go to Chile, South America. So I went to Patagonia, and I was looking for this little fella called a codcod, Oncocephalus guinea, which is a small cat found in the mountains in southern Patagonia. And we were trying to find this cat, but we were also trapping small mammals. These small mammals potentially have hantavirus, which is a disease, so we had to be totally kitted up to try and stop getting diseases. So I'd been to Chile to help out one of my research assistants, and I was asked to go again to study another area, which is in the Pampas area. This is near Lago Genemeni. And CONAF, which is the organisation in Chile, asked us to go and do some biodiversity surveys in this area because there was a road being built. They wanted to know what carnivores, what mammals were in the area, so they could look at the impact of the road after it happened. So a lot of the time, we're going in and dealing with conflict as it already occurs. What was impressive about the Chile situation is they were trying to preempt conflict. They were trying to preempt the fact that carnivores may be lost in this area and what conflict may occur. So my toolbox is conflict can be prevented by planning and management. And baseline data on distributions and densities is needed to look at the effect before we start messing around with things. So I started teaching fully in Brighton when I got back from Chile. And so this is some of my first students, and I still remember some of their names quite a long time ago. And that was an incredible experience for me. It was really nice to be able to start teaching some of the things I'd learned. But I also had to set up some research projects. And my partner at the time, Tom, had gone from studying cheetahs in the Serengeti to tigers. So he was working on a project in Indonesia looking at the impacts of palm oil on tiger ecology. And the idea here, this is palm oil here, so this is forest being cleared for palm oil plantation. The back here you can see the palm oil monoculture being grown up. And we were wanting to look at what this impact had on biodiversity. And specifically the tigers, because Sumatran tigers, there's probably only around 200-300 left in the wild. And the palm oil here, kernels, drop from the trees, and this attracts pigs to come in. The tigers like to eat pigs. The tigers follow the pigs in, and if you've got workers harvesting the palm oil, that can cause conflict because the tigers could possibly also injure the people. So this is an area with potential wildlife conflict, but also we have a very rare population of tigers. Habitat is being changed and their ecology is changed. So I was brought in to do small mammals and small carnivores. So this is leopard cat, one of my study species, clouded leopard, and we were also monitoring some of the other carnivores, potential conflict, such as sun bears. And whilst we were out there, we managed to catch the first wild Sumatran tiger and radio collar it. He was called Slamit. And so this helped us understand the movement of tigers in these landscapes. This is our tiger capture team over here. There's me, looking a lot skinnier and younger. Next to me is a guy called Bart. And this is Bart setting a foothold trap for a tiger. So he was the most experienced tiger and bear trapper in the whole world, I think. A few years after this was taken, Bart was hunting in Canada, and unfortunately, he was killed by a bear. So I wanted to put a picture of Bart in just to acknowledge that I've also lost friends through human-carnivore conflict, and I think that we also need to understand that that conflict can result in losses to human life and irreplaceable losses to human life. So you can't put a measure on that. But it can also cause losses to endangered species that we really critically need to look after. So there can be extreme losses on both sides. And from the Indonesia situation is humans changing these landscapes are causing the conflict. The animals are just trying to respond, are just trying to adapt. Another project that I was involved with shortly after starting at Brighton was an Earthwatch project in Estonia. Now, this doesn't have anything to do with carnivores, but it's important in my story because it's where I first started working with Earthwatch. So this project was with Maureen Berg and Chris Joyce, and I was mainly radio tracking striped mice in a reed bed to look at the impact of coastal flooding on their movements. But with Earthwatch, the Earthwatch volunteers paid to come out to work on research projects. So these projects are funded by citizens that are passionate about research, that want to come out and help. And this is a part of a sort of funding that people want to actually get involved with research. Also, after starting at Brighton, I went to a conference in South Africa. Now, I'd visited South Africa before. You can see again me trying to get close to cute fairy animals at any opportunity. So Tom had been working on a behaviour project in the Kalahari with meerkats, so I said, yes, I'm going to come and try and get close to meerkats. And so I'd visited South Africa, and whilst visiting South Africa, I'd visited a site called Manqui. So those of you who've been to Manqui might not recognise this photo, because there's only one building there, and that's when I went. And there was one person there, basically, which is Dougal, and he managed the reserve by hunting. So it was, all the income mainly came from hunting. But when I went to the conference, I revisited Manqui and stayed there, and I met Lynn, Dougal's daughter, and she wanted to change this site so the income wasn't based on hunting, but it was based on education, conservation, and research. So with Lynn, discussing this, we wrote a field trip for the University of Brighton students to go out and learn about African ecosystems. So this was using my experience from Zambia, my experience from working with volunteers, and trying to get students to have an amazing experience, life-changing experience, because of all the places I'd been and what I'd done, I wanted to share that. So this is one of our first groups of students that went to South Africa. We also set up research. So our first PhD student, this is Dr. Richard Yarnell over here, who now is an associate professor at Nottingham Trent University, who teaches conservation. Yes. And he went out to study small mammals because we knew we'd get some data on small mammals and vegetation, and he was looking at the impacts of burn on communities. But Rick's a bit like me. He likes other animals as well, and he got interested in carnivores. So we started talking about carnivores on site, and one of the carnivores on site is one of my favourite carnivores in the world, and that is the brown hyena, the stripy-legged bear dog. So an amazing animal not many people know much about, but in South Africa at the time, heavily persecuted. So shot, snared, poisoned. So Rick and I, after he finished his PhD, we got back in touch with Earthwatch, and we wrote a project on brown hyenas in South Africa as a new project. Now, the nice thing about Earthwatch is we get the questions from the stakeholders. So in this case, we wanted to know why people were killing these animals. Where were they? Was it affecting their populations? And then the scientists come on board to try and help. We work with volunteers who are paying to come out to get involved with these research projects to make a difference. We work with teachers on site, and we also work with the local communities. So the problem here was that human carnivores were coming into conflict in an agricultural landscape. So the northwest province of South Africa is covered with cattle farmers and agriculture, and it's one of the most environmentally stressed areas in South Africa. There was high levels of persecution, not just hyenas, but jackals, leopards, cheetahs as well. And we knew very little about the impact of this. So this, unfortunately, is a hyena, and you can see a snare wound around its neck. It's managed to survive in this case. So I could get my Coexistence Toolbox and take out everything I've learnt to try and work out how best to approach this human-carnivore conflict problem. So first of all, assess the problem. Work out what's going on. Try to work out why that conflict is happening by talking to people. Try to assess what the actual economic losses were, and try to assess sort of the levels of persecution, how many animals are being killed, and does that affect populations. Understand there are cultural differences and approach that in a sensitive way. Try to provide baseline data on species, and that might actually be working out how we survey them in the first place, and then actually trying to also explore whether management works or whether we need to find out other management approaches. So Earthwatch, we've had over 400 Earthwatch volunteers on this project over 9 years from 17 different countries. Our oldest was about 82 and our youngest about 15, so very varied. And they helped us do a lot of the baseline data, collecting, surveying lots of poo, again, setting up camera traps. And alongside the Earthwatch, we also had PhD students. So this is one of the first PhD students working on this project, which was Michelle Thorne. And she did a lot of the baseline work on trying to work out how we survey carnivores. So again, whether sign surveys work, camera trapping, looking at whether call-ins work. And so we've got 3 publications that we did with Michelle, just trying to validate the methods in the first place. And from the camera trapping, we didn't just get our target species, which is the brown hyena, gorgeous animals. We also got things like leopards, cheetahs, serval, lot of caracal, lots of others. So what Michelle did as part of her PhD is also look at carnivores across the whole region. So she used her methods to survey the whole of the Northwest Province to come up with new distribution maps for 8 different carnivores to act as baseline data for monitoring populations. In the final part of her PhD, which led on to her postdoc, Michelle was asking people about what they thought about carnivores, how many they killed, and what the drivers were behind that conflict. And what was interesting in this is that actually less than 3% of livestock were being killed by people. Less than 3% of livestock were being killed by carnivores. However, in retaliation, some of our estimates, 18,000 jackals a year were being killed in this region in response to that less than 3% loss. So that's a huge amount of retaliation. Some of these numbers that we extrapolated are quite high, 134 cheetahs being killed, lots of leopards, and also brown hyenas. So in some cases, very unsustainable. And the attitudes of why seems to be cultural, and it seems to be more social than actually economic, why people are killing carnivores in this area. We had another PhD student, Louisa, who was mainly focusing on the hyenas. So she took the region, this was the Northwest Province, she went across the whole of South Africa and said, okay, where are the hyenas? Where are the brown hyenas? And so she came up with new distribution maps for the whole of South Africa. And we also found out from this that actually hyenas can survive in human-dominated landscapes. Many carnivores can't. Hyenas, jackals, caracals can. So there is hope if we can stop the persecution. We also were radio tracking brown hyenas. This is Bonnie, one of our hyenas with a radio collar. And we were looking at their movements in protected and non-protected areas to look at the impacts of landscape and landscape change on their ecology. This is Pilanesberg National Park, and we can see our hyenas roam quite widely in the park. In comparison to a farmland, they don't go very far. So this is contradictory to what we expected, and also these home ranges are very small compared to brown hyenas in the rest of their range, such as Namibia. Another PhD student, Rob, he was focusing on looking at the jackals. So 18,000 jackals killed every year is huge, but it didn't seem to be affecting the population of jackals. And so he wanted to know how the population was responding to this culling management. So again, more poo. So what Rob did is found poo and he tried to identify individual jackals from poo. So he had to do a method to work out being able to do that by extracting DNA and working up microsatellite markers. And he managed to do that so that he could then go and study and look at the impacts of culling on the population. What was interesting in Rob's work is that this is different management types here on the bottom, and this is jackals. And you will see on this side, this is sites that are not managed and the number of jackals. These are sites that are managed here and not managed. If you do lethal control of jackals, you increase the number of jackals on your site. Shooting does not control jackal numbers. It actually causes an increase. Non-managed sites have lower jackals. Now, one of the reasons for that is because of this side. This is the carnivores. Lethal control of carnivores. There seems to be no significant difference between lethal and non-managed. So most of the sites that are doing lethal control are taking out all the carnivores. Whereas if you have a leopard on the site, that actually helps control carnivores by competing with those animals. So actually, our management of culling is not necessarily helping control the problem that we want to control. So has our data actually changed anybody's opinion? Now, Niall Walkden is our final PhD student who's been working on this project, and he's been looking at the sort of value, the ecosystem value and the cultural value of scavengers. And he talked to some of the farmers that had previously worked with Rob. And what was really nice is some of these farmers said because of what we'd done, they'd actually changed their practice and stopped killing jackals. We also work with South African teachers, now help with this as well. And the teachers wanted to know how the children and what affected the children's behaviour towards carnivores. So we came up with a questionnaire and we asked the kids what they thought about different carnivores. And we can see here from this figure that hyenas actually feature quite low in children's attitude. This axis is affect, which is like an emotion. And this one is how valued they think in terms of utility. So hyenas are quite low down, whereas they love leopards and lions. Over here, you can see there's an impact of age. So the older they are, the more positive they are towards carnivores. We can see a gender difference. And down here, what was interesting is, again, it's culture. So children who have pets are more positive towards carnivores. Children who have experience with wildlife are more positive towards carnivores. So get your kids out there, give them pets, let them experience nature. They're likely to be more positive. And you can probably see here, I make my kids come out with me and cuddle animals. This is a genetic sort of stranglehold. You can see one of my sons has adapted the same ability to cuddle animals if they ever get close to him. And my other son who's come out badger trapping with me. So this is an important part in my talk because this is a change of my career. Up until now, I've been gallivanting around the world, going to as many countries and studying as many species as possible. But life changes, and you grow up, and you have families, and that means you have to change your focus. And so I went from focusing overseas to thinking about work in the UK. So when I started work back in the UK, having to focus, I did still do small mammals, so I've done some work on dormice with a PhD student, Debbie Glass, water voles with Fran Southgate, water shrews with Fran Southgate and water voles with Rowena Baker. And so I still do lots of small mammal work and hedgehogs with Rick Yarnall and the RSPCA. But I'm still keeping my interest in human-carnivore conflict. So at the moment, I have a project with the RSPB, and we're looking at whether we can do non-lethal management of carnivores in protected areas. So foxes and badgers do like to go into areas and tend to eat protected species like waders, which is obviously a big problem. So there's a conflict there. So if we can try to do ways of encourage them away from these breeding sites, that's what we're trying to work on with the RSPB at the moment. And one project that I'm probably most famous for is my interest in urban foxes. So urban foxes have made a lot of media, made it into the press, and I think most of you are aware of their ability to colonize and be able to coexist with us in cities, which has been happening over the last 100 years. But what I find the most interesting, after having worked with tigers, lions, hyenas, and coming back to the UK and having somebody tell me they are terrified of a fox because it might come into the house and maybe bite them or something, and you go, really? Really? I find this attitude and relationship with foxes in the UK quite interesting after having worked with many cultures where we're dealing with large carnivores with potential mortality. So when I got interested in this, one of the things that people were saying, foxes are taking over the world, they're invading our cities, they're out of control, we should cull them. And I'm thinking, well, culling doesn't work. And are they out of control? What are their numbers? And sometimes it feels like we're overrun by foxes, as in this video. But this is about ecology, it's about understanding. Foxes go through cycles where the cub numbers will increase because they give birth, and then most of these won't survive. They won't form the breeding population. 1 in 6 cubs survive till the next year. So this is about people's perception and understanding about the ecology of a carnivore. So with Dr. Bryony Tolhurst, who was a colleague who started at Brighton, who's got a background in badgers and also foxes, we were approached by Channel 4 and Windfall Films to work with them on a project called Foxes Live, Wild in the City. And this was to sort of feed some of the public interest in urban foxes and the changes in foxes. And what me and Bryony did is we discussed with the TV programme, can we collect loads of data while the TV programme's on? So we also allowed people to submit their sightings. We asked them to do opinion questionnaires. And we also radio collared, like live tracking foxes. So we had loads and loads of input from this, from the general public. And this programme won awards for its public engagement. So this is some of the data that you get from 3-week programme broadcast on Channel 4, asking people to send their records of foxes. We got around about 10,000 records in a couple of weeks. And the blue and the red dots are the recent records of where foxes are. And this has changed in the last 30 years. So what we showed is urban foxes are now present across the whole of the country. Most cities have breeding populations of urban foxes compared to 30 years ago. We are always asked how many foxes there are, which is quite hard, because all we had is an indication of how many foxes people had seen, which doesn't relate to density. So what we did is we went out to tackle the density as well as a few other questions. And this is with Naomi Charman, who was working on the project at the time. We radio tracked foxes across Brighton and other places of the UK. This is Brighton, some of our foxes. So we had 22 foxes. Radio tracked some fantastic names here. I blame Bryony for some of these names and some of the students as well. And so we monitored fox movements across the city to see how it was affected, how urban environments affected them. But what we also could find out with working with the RSPCA, how management, like taking an animal into captivity, into rehab, affected their behaviour. So with one of the papers that we worked on is looking at displacement. So this is a fox that hasn't been gone into rehab. This is a fox that has gone into rehab. So if you take a fox and put it into captivity and treat it and then bring it back and release it, it really disrupts it. It really disrupts its home range and it can't really integrate back into the group. So what you need to do is if there are foxes that need to be treated, if they're injured or maimed, you're best treating them in situ. In some areas, we managed to get quite high data. So these are our foxes from this group. And here we have radio tracking. So this is really interesting. Fox territories really go right up to each other. Every single space in Brighton is packed with a fox territory. As you walk out here, you'll be walking into a fox territory with a family group that's probably inherited that territory for multiple years, maybe 30 years. Each of these family groups has a different number of adults, and if we know the size of the area, we can work out the density. So we use this along with another method. We ask people, have you seen fox cubs? Now, each group tends to have 1 litter of fox cubs per year. So if we count the number of fox cubs in an area, we can work out how many fox groups there are. If we know what the average group size is, we can then work out density. So we've done this in 8 cities across the UK with replicates within cities to come up with a density. And I'm sorry, media, we are not overrun by foxes. We worked out there's about 12 foxes per kilometre squared. So that's about 1 fox for every sort of 600 houses, something like that. So there's a lot more people than foxes, and there's a lot more cats than foxes as well. So fox numbers have increased, their distribution has increased, but not to the numbers that are perceived in the press. We also radio tracked badgers, because badgers are also adapting to urban environments. So this is one of our urban badgers. We also looked at their movements, and this is very different from foxes. Badger territories don't go right next to each other. They're quite spread out, and they like different types of habitat in an urban environment. They like more green space. And we managed to use this method with badgers and foxes to publish a new method using citizen science to come up with densities that people can use in different countries, not just the UK. So coming back to our radio tracking data, this is my last thing I'm going to talk about. This is a movement of a fox in one night. And you can probably guess what's going on in these 2 little places here and here. What do you think's in this garden and this garden? Probably guess it's food. So this fox, and his name's Fleet, doesn't have to travel very far in a night. He can get all he needs in 2 gardens. So what we're finding is that feeding behaviour by people is affecting movement of not just foxes, but other urban animals as well. And why are people feeding foxes? Well, in our surveys on Foxes Live, we asked people what they thought about foxes. 89% of people said they liked foxes, and 81% of people said they enrich their lives. There is a lot of fox love going out there in the cities. Yeah, and a lot of people want to get close and enjoy foxes. So whatever the media says, there's a lot of people who are enjoying having foxes in their gardens. But one of the worrying concerns is about how people are feeding. So this is what we asked people what they fed. And unfortunately, in here is quite a lot of non-healthy foods, a lot of carbohydrate, fat-based items. And what we're seeing is sometimes quite unhealthy fat foxes. How many people feed foxes? From our different surveys, we reckon between about 10 and 20 people feed foxes in a city where there's foxes. And also, unfortunately, we're finding of those people that feed foxes, 1 in 5 are feeding by the back door, and 1 in 5 are actually feeding by hand. So when we get problems reported of foxes, such as coming into houses and nibbling people's hands, and we work out how many people are feeding foxes and how many people are feeding by hand, that's a lot of people in a city feeding foxes by hand. And this is a small number, but this is where foxes become at risk of being scared. People are being scared and fearful of foxes, especially if they're coming into houses. But if you feed a fox in your back kitchen, or you feed a fox by your back door, you're encouraging it to come into other people's houses as well. So Fleet the fox was a famous fox. He wandered around these few back gardens, but he also became a world record-breaking fox. And that's because a couple of Christmases ago, he decided to leave Brighton one Christmas Eve, ran out of Brighton, and ran nearly 200 miles in 2 weeks. He sent me a text and went, sorry, leaving Brighton. And I did get a text, I did get a GPS, and I was like, where's he going? And he ran off. And so he was reported across the world as the longest distance fox ever moved, recorded by a GPS collar. But for us, this is really interesting because this shows us how foxes are colonizing and moving across the city and how they've moved into new cities. Fleet became famous not just because of his record-breaking movement, but also he was featured on Springwatch. And I've been incredibly lucky to be able to communicate some of our research with the media. So I've worked with One Show on some projects on stoats and weasels, obviously with Foxes Live, and Unsprung and Springwatch, and I've worked with Chris on a few different programs, not just with Springwatch, with other programs as well. And this is because people are interested. They want to do the right thing. They're interested about wildlife. And so I think communication is key to helping people understand and reduce that conflict. Because of the opportunities I've had with work in the media, I've been able to launch public engagement projects such as Springtails last year, where we asked people for videos, and we had over 700 videos submitted. And this is helping us understand not just how humans interact with wildlife, but also how wildlife interact with other wildlife when there's big bowls of food. Now, this is a nice positive interaction, but that's not always the case. So this is the study that we're doing at the moment. So finally, so what have I learned from my journey? In human-carnivore conflict, it's talk to people. The more people you talk, they'll tell you their stories, they'll tell you why, what drives their passion, what drives their conflict, and that helps you untangle what the issues are. In your career, those of you starting out, take any opportunity that comes along. Say yes to everything, especially if it seems a bit scary. Really push yourself, because you never know where it's going to lead you. That's what I did, and I've had some amazing experiences. It might not have been strategic, but it's been amazing. Progression. So in terms of career progression, so this is to my colleagues, and those of you coming through, support your colleagues, support people. They will support you back. I've had amazing support. I don't like crawling on top of people to get where I want. I've been there to try and help people, and those people help you too. So always be kind and help people. You'll get it back tenfold. And finally, for conservation and the future, communicate to people, communicate to the younger generation. That's why I teach. So finally, huge thanks to everybody in the room and everybody I've worked with and everybody who has supported me along the way, and also to my amazing family, especially my mum, and my sisters, and my husband, and my kids, and all my extended family and my friends who have helped me along the way. Thank you so much. So may I now invite Professor Andrew Lloyd, Associate Pro-Vice Chancellor of Academic Operations, to close the event.
Thank you, Dawn. Thank you for a fantastic lecture. As David said at the beginning, the purpose of an inaugural lecture is to allow people to communicate the science that they've done, to allow their colleagues to appreciate that, but also to do it in a way in which the public audience can understand that. I think you'll agree with me that Dawn has done an exceptional job today in terms of presenting her journey into her research. And I think we can all see why she has this affection for soft, furry animals, soft, furry carnivores, and her passion, which came through really clearly in the presentation today, for citizen science and for doing work which will change the way in which we humans interact with carnivores and in which carnivores interact with each other. So I'd just like to ask you again to join with me to thank Dawn for an exceptional, eloquent, thought-provoking lecture.